Add more weight. Hello, and welcome to Dr. Vitka's Myths, Legends, and Lore. I'm your host, Dr. Vitka, and welcome to our channel. We're going to be discussing strange things from New England's past and present. We're going to be delving into topics from murder and mystery, aliens, monsters. We're going to talk about Schubert the Seal. We're going to talk about everything that's interesting and weird. Ooh. And today, we're going to start off with something big. We're going to be visiting a crappy parking lot and discussing where one of the most horrifying events from the witch trials took place. What if I told you that Giles Corey wasn't the hero you might think he was? We'll find out as you learn the shocking true story of Giles Corey and the curse he put on the city of Salem. Come with me now. We're heading to the parking lot. So here we are in the Church Street parking lot, sandwiched between an office building and a crumbling shopping center. It's the middle of the day. Why would we be somewhere like this? This doesn't seem spooky at all. Well, this is where one of the most horrible events from the witch trials took place. It's widely believed that this stretch of land is where Giles Corey was painfully pressed to death. So Giles Corey was a Puritan, a member of a bizarre religious sect from England. The Puritans were Christians, but not nice Christians. They were so strict they make the Westboro Baptist Church people of today seem reasonable by comparison. The Puritans were pests, and nobody wanted them in England, so they decided to move to the New World to set up a religious theocracy where they could worship as they wanted to and get rid of everybody else. Giles Corey joined the Puritan experiment and came to the Americas. Giles Corey was a Puritan, and he was a nasty one. But not because he was overly religious, it was because he was a ruthless businessman, cruel to his neighbors and his few friends. Giles Corey had a past. Giles Corey hired a man to do some work for him, hired him specifically because he was handicapped and he could pay him a lot less than a regular wage. This man decided to get what he wanted, stole a few apples from Giles Corey, and Giles Corey savagely beat him to death. Giles Corey avoided a murder charge by claiming he'd simply injured the man, and the man died of his own accord from the injuries. Giles Corey simply had to pay a small fine and was able to move on with his life. His wife, too, was no nice lady. She was a social climber. People didn't really like her, and she wanted to get Giles Corey into the church so that she could rise through the ranks and be fully accepted as a member of the congregation. The problem is, Giles Corey didn't really want to do it, nor would he qualify. Here in Salem town, if you wanted to be a full member of the congregation, you had to confess all your dirty sins in front of the entire congregation. There's no way that murdering illiterate Giles Corey was going to do it. So how was Martha going to be able to slide him in? Well, she found a loophole. She was able to go to neighboring Salem Village. They had less people, and they needed more people in their church, so they were less stringent with the rules. All you had to do to be a full member of the congregation in Salem Village was to basically take a pledge saying you were going to be on good behavior for a month. If you could get done with this month of good behavior, you were a full member of the congregation. Giles Corey sucked it up, he was nice for a month, and he was able to become a full-fledged member of the Salem Village congregation. And that meant he was able to transfer to Salem town and be a full member of that congregation. He was able to take communion, what they called the Lord's Supper. Can you imagine the Puritans having to sit next to Giles Corey? Strict, rigid Puritans, knowing that this murdering, mean man had been able to skate by the rules and now was a full member of their society. Given their notorious reputation, it makes sense that when the witch trial accusations started swirling, Giles and Martha Corey quickly found themselves in the crosshairs. Martha was probably the first one to see the writing on the wall. She knew that given her checkered past, she was going to be accused quickly. She wanted to stay as far away from it all as possible. She wanted her and Giles to stay so far away, she even hid his riding saddle so he couldn't saddle up his horse and go into town and watch the proceedings. Well, Martha got accused anyway, and Giles chose to throw her under the bus. Rather than defending her, Giles came out and said she was a witch, said she'd cursed him, said she'd caused him ox cart accident using spells. He claimed he saw her doing a witch's prayer sitting by the fireplace. Based in part on Giles Corey's own testimony, his wife was tossed in the dungeon. Maybe Giles accused her to get the stink off of him and save his own life. But that didn't last long. Giles Corey was accused too, and the accusations were getting bizarre. One of the afflicted girls, a Susanna Shelton, claimed that she'd seen Giles Corey playing with his witch's familiar, an evil animal that was supposed to go out and do the witch's wicked bidding. She claimed that she'd seen Giles Corey feeding an enormous snapping turtle from his own nipples. For crazy things like that, imaginary false charges, Giles Corey was locked up in the dungeon too. I can only imagine how miserable that reunion with his wife must have been. When Giles Corey's number came up, he refused to plead innocent or guilty in court. Giles Corey knew that as long as he did not make a plea of innocent or guilty, they could not proceed with his trial. And if they didn't proceed with his trial, that meant they couldn't legally kill him, and they also couldn't take his money and property. Giles Corey would have known that cruel High Sheriff Corwin and other unscrupulous people in the local government were using the Salem Witch Trials to line their own pockets with the money and land that belonged to the victims who were found guilty. Giles Corey knew that if he didn't plead, they couldn't take his stuff, and he wouldn't be killed. He thought he would be able to keep his mouth shut, and he might be able to get out free, just like he was able to escape the murder charge. As long as he did what they called standing mute, Giles Corey had a chance to survive the witch trials. So that's how Giles Corey lived his miserable life. But now, we're going to get to his death. Now it's time for what everybody in Salem was waiting for. Now here comes the pressing. We're standing within sight of where the witch dungeon had been. The office building you may see behind me is the location of the notorious witch dungeon. Where we are right now is where it's believed that Giles Corey was painfully pressed to death, and where it's believed by many that his body still lies. There had actually been a precedent for pressing here in Salem. About 50 years before the Salem Witch Trials, there was a scandalous murder case. A woman named Dorothy Talby had killed her infant child, who she'd named Difficulty. At first, Dorothy confessed to everything, but when it came time for her trial, she was in such a state of shock she didn't want to say anything until they threatened to press her. Upon the pressing being evoked, Dorothy started talking. She admitted to everything. She went so far as to say she'd rather be decapitated with an axe than be pressed to death. When it was Giles Corey's turn, the threat of a pressing didn't seem to faze him. He was so obstinate, he was going to go through with it. He knew that as long as he did not get convicted, the cruel High Sheriff Corwin and the unscrupulous people of Salem weren't going to be able to absorb his wealth and lands. And if he somehow managed to survive, as long as he didn't go through with the trial, they wouldn't be able to kill him. When Giles Corey refused to enter a plea, Sheriff Corwin decided he was going to make him. Sheriff Corwin dragged Giles Corey from the dungeon, brought him out to this area. Then they took a shovel, dug a pit in the ground. When the pit was deep enough, Giles Corey's clothing was ripped from his body. He was thrown into the pit. A huge piece of wood was placed on top of him, probably the door from a house. The sheriff started to add heavier and heavier stones onto his body. He'd look down into the pit and ask,
"How do you plead, innocent or guilty?"
Giles Corey didn't say anything, so Sheriff Corwin kept adding heavier and heavier stones to his body. This went on for about 3 days, and every time it asked,
"How do you plead?"
Giles Corey stood mute, so they added heavier and heavier stones. By the end of the 3rd day, there were thousands of pounds of weight pressing down on Giles Corey. His eyes were bulging out of his head. He was gasping for breath. His face was purple and his tongue was poking out of his mouth. The sheriff knew he'd beaten Giles Corey. He took a stick from the ground and jammed his tongue back down in his throat. He asked him one last time. He said,
You're going to die. How do you plead?
Well, they say that this time, Giles Corey looked up at Sheriff Corwin, spat at him as hard as he could, and after days of torture, he finally said something. Giles Corey told Sheriff Corwin to add more weight. Sheriff Corwin was so enraged by Giles Corey, he picked up the heaviest stone he could and smashed it down on the old man. They say that Giles Corey's ribcage shattered. People who saw it say he was so crushed his organs squashed out of his sides. And as he lay there dying, the last words he allegedly said were, "Damn you, Sheriff Corwin, I curse you and all of Salem." And with that, Giles Corey perished. Now, since he didn't actually end up getting convicted, the sheriff and his minions weren't able to steal his land. In death, his family was able to keep the lands. Now, some people say that Giles Corey's body was left right here where it was pressed. Personally, I believe that's the truth. Generally, they wouldn't move the body of a witch and give them a proper burial. Some people say that under the cover of night, his sons stole him away and buried him in the humorously named Butts Hollow in neighboring Peabody, Massachusetts. But as far as I'm concerned, Giles Corey is here beneath our feet. Now, Giles Corey was never found guilty. He never made a plea, so he wasn't counted as one of the executed victims from the witch trials. He died of torture, not execution. So technically, he wasn't one of the victims recognized as an executed victim of the witch trials. And as far as I'm concerned, as best I can tell, as best history gives us, his body is here underneath the earth. Now, Giles Corey's curse did come true. Sheriff Corwin died shortly after Giles Corey's pressing. He was only in his 30s, and he had a sudden heart attack and died. Now, it's not just Sheriff Corwin himself who suffered. Every sheriff in Salem since then, up until present times, has died young too, from heart attacks or blood disease. This was first discovered in the early 1980s by the late Sheriff Robert Cahill when he was working on a book about Salem's law enforcement history. Now, it's not just the sheriffs who suffer when they see Giles Corey. According to the legend, anybody who comes in contact with Giles Corey pays the price. If just one or two people see Giles Corey, it's a personal tragedy for the witness. If the whole group sees Giles Corey, it's tragedy for the entire community. One of the most famous examples of a sighting of Giles Corey happened in 1914, right before the Great Fire of 1914 destroyed the city of Salem. It took place in the Howard Street Cemetery, one street over that way. Late in the night, a number of people who lived along Howard Street noticed an old man wandering around in the cemetery. They thought he was lost and confused, and they went to help him. When they got close, they realized something was wrong with this man. He looked like the illustrations and scene of Giles Corey. His clothing was about 200 years out of date. Somebody reached out to shake his hand, and the figure vanished into thin air. The next day, the city of Salem burned to the ground. People say that sighting of Giles Corey was an omen that the tragedy was going to happen. Thank you very much for joining us for this very first installment of Dr. Vitka's Myths, Legends, and Lore. I was your host, Dr. Vitka. I probably still am. And thank you for watching. Stay with us as we'll be discussing even more strange subjects in the near future. If you have ideas for a weird tale of New England that you'd like discussed, don't stand mute like Giles Corey. Send us a message and let us know. I have some pressing business to attend to. What's that? Do you hear that? It's getting closer. It's getting closer. What could it be? It's here. There he is. No, it's coming. It's coming.